inform to empower. We're tackling gender-based violence, the ongoing pandemic, by raising awareness and hopefully moving us one step closer to finding lasting solutions. Hello, I'm Stacey Ann Smith, your moderator for this, our first in a three-part series of webinars designed to stimulate dialogue and to drive action. These online events are brought to you by Stronger Together, powered by the U.S. Embassy in Kingston, Danrak Productions, and PR Belle Media. Special welcome to our participants on Zoom who have joined us for the conversation. We're looking forward to hearing your thoughts, comments, and questions. Our Stronger Together team is live in the chat, so go ahead and type in those comments and questions. To my guests on set, I extend a very warm welcome. I have with me Attorney at Law Jamar Clark.
Hi, Stacey.
Dr. Delia Bean, lecturer at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies, Mona. And Judon Bowden, Board Director of the Caribbean Society for Human Resources. Thank you so much for joining us, guys. We are 1 week away from the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and Girls. And so our focus on gender-based violence isn't by accident at all. We want to inspire action, and it's something our partners at the U.S. Embassy are also passionate about. They have provided support for this knowledge-sharing initiative, which will also make it possible for 25 persons who have been impacted by gender-based violence to get free counseling. We'll share more on that later. Sounds good?
Good.
Right. Right now, though, let's hear from Robert Adelson, Public Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy in Kingston.
Gender-based violence is a reality which unfortunately continues to worsen, especially since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Referred to as the shadow pandemic, the United Nations reports that all types of violence against women and girls, particularly domestic violence, has intensified globally. Here too in Jamaica, women and girls continue to face serious sexual and gender-based violence issues. A 2018 UN survey showed that more than 1 in 4 Jamaican women experience intimate partner physical and sexual violence in their lifetime. Promoting gender equality is a long-standing cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy. We continue to seek partnerships that stem violence and promote the social, economic, and political empowerment of women. With the launch of our gender strategy, the United States also reaffirms its commitment to enabling the full potential of all individuals. This strategy underscores that progress will require a strategic approach that addresses the discrimination, systemic barriers, and human rights abuses and violations that have far too long inhibited the full empowerment of women and girls around the world. Gender equality not only are a matter of human rights and fairness, but when presented together promote inclusive economic growth, advance peace, security, and rule of law. Advancing women's economic empowerment is critical to addressing the challenges facing our time, including COVID-19, climate change, gender-based violence, and racial, social, and economic inequality. Gender inequality is a driver rather than a symptom of poverty. The United States is committed to increasing women's economic security and opportunities at home and abroad by addressing barriers to women's recruitment, retention, professional development, and promotion. The U.S. Embassy would also like to draw further attention to the fact that Jamaican males also face major challenges. 1 out of 3 young men in Jamaica are not engaged in employment, education, or training, many ending up in gang-related activities and other acts of social deviance. We acknowledge that this too is a serious issue which contributes to gender-based violence in Jamaica. We congratulate our program partner, Danrak Productions, under the leadership of Ms. Stacey Ann Smith, for taking the step to craft this webinar series. We believe that stakeholders and thought leaders sharing in these discussions will offer great insight on the intricate issues confronting victims. These strategies will educate, empower, and energize persons to take steps towards overcoming gender-based violence and help us to become stronger together.
Thank you so much for that, Bobby. And we definitely are stronger together. This series of panel discussions and webinars is really, as he said, about helping us, giving us those tools. I mean, I believe that the greatest thing is to know, and sometimes what you know will help to empower you. So as he mentioned, we will be going into more on intimate partner violence and looking at violence against men as well in this 3-part series. But first, we will tackle in this webinar focusing on sexual harassment and looking at it as one of those factors that help to feed gender-based violence. But of course, we have to start off with some definitions. We've been talking about gender-based violence, GBV as it's referred to. But Delia, I'll start with you. When we talk about gender-based violence, exactly what do we mean?
Okay, so that's a really good question to start with, Stacey. And what we mean is any harm or violence that's perpetrated against someone because of their gender or sex or sexual orientation, gender identity. These are the types of things that we're speaking about. So we tend to look at it as, we tend to use it interchangeably with violence against women, but it's broader than that. It does have to do with any violence that's taking place as a result of gender.
Okay, and we also talked about intimate partner violence. How is that different from gender-based violence?
So gender-based violence is a more umbrella term for any type of violent interaction. It can be with a stranger, someone you know, on the street. But intimate partner violence specifically speaks to the type of violence that happens in an intimate relationship. And this doesn't have to be actually a current intimate relationship. Mm-hmm. This can actually be something that takes place among partners who are no longer in that sort of relationship, but it still would come under that umbrella.
And I'm gonna go now into looking at domestic violence, because sometimes we hear the term domestic violence and it's used interchangeably with intimate partner violence. Is it the same?
No, it's used interchangeably, but it's not the same. Domestic violence tends to speak to violence or harm being perpetrated in a domestic space. So that means in the household. This doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be among intimate partners. You could have violence between mother and child, or an uncle and niece, you know, people who live in a yard that has multiple persons in that domestic space. You would refer to that as domestic violence. But intimate partner violence is specifically about persons who are in intimate romantic relationship.
Is the distinction important though?
I think it is. So, you know, we tend to use some of these things as broad terms, but legislatively, in terms of dealing with the problem, in terms of social services that have to be put in place to tackle these issues, it's very useful to understand the differences, because it's different power dynamics that cause these acts of violence to take place, and different types of feelings. I mean, how you feel about a romantic partner and the violence that can come from that is very different from how you would treat a child or you know, someone else who lives in your household. So the distinction is important, but of course, a lot of the root causes are very similar. But I think in terms of tackling the issues, it's important to understand the differences.
From your expertise and from your experience as a gender specialist, what is the connection between sexual harassment and gender-based violence?
Well, sexual harassment is a form of gender-based violence because, so if you're looking at a hierarchy, you would start with gender-based violence as the overarching concept. And then under gender-based violence, you would have sexual harassment, intimate partner violence, incest, you know, various sorts of offshoots. So it's a form of gender-based violence because it's normally perpetrated, again, as a result of that person's gender or sex, as the case may be, because there is a difference there. So it's a sort of subset. The easy way to put it is that it's a sort of subset of gender-based violence.
I want to move the conversation now into what is, as we know it in Jamaica, our experience with sexual harassment. For me, I have spoken about it before. I tweeted recently after watching a popular show on television about one of my first memories of being harassed. I mean, of course, at the time, I had no clue. I mean, I was 11 years old when this man said something. I'm not even sure if I can repeat it in this forum, but it traumatized me, and I wasn't even sure what it meant. And I just remember feeling very afraid, you know, the tone and the body language. And I'm going to ask the gentlemen to jump in on the conversation around the kind of sometimes animosity, I would call it. I mean, there are some persons who think that it's okay. What do you say to men who, you know, do the catcalling and the calling out to women on the road? Do you have, first of all, friends or people who you've seen and observed doing it? You can start, Jadon.
Well, I mean, it's a very interesting and very relevant discussion topic. I think we as a society have grown accustomed to really embracing and treating these things as acceptable. But over time, we have recognized the stress, the trauma, the mental disorder that this has created for our society. I've observed it. Maybe in my younger days, I would have probably done it. So I'm not going to excuse myself from it. But the more you grow, the more you get mature, the more you're exposed, you recognize that these things are very harmful. It also from a context of society, men appear or think we're the dominant gender. So therefore what we do sometimes we don't see it as being wrong. And so we don't come from a point of respect for ourselves and respect for each other, which is why we sometimes go off in these situations where we're making these advances towards women that are inappropriate, and they are downright inappropriate. And I think it's something that we have to call out as men when we see it amongst our fellow male partners, male counterparts, to say, hey, this is something that we should not do, and this is something that I will not tolerate. And as a man to man, here's why it is not good for us to be doing it.
Jamar, if you could also speak a little bit to the mindset. I mean, Jordan was brave enough to say, you know, maybe in my younger days, I would be one of those calling to the women, you know. Tell me a little bit more, as you understand it, the mindset that says, you know, I am dominant and therefore I should be commenting on your person and beneath top or your bottom round and that kind of thing on the road.
Well, Stacey, it's interesting because I really wanted to mention that as well. One good thing is that we're having a conversation about it, because what I think is some men genuinely don't understand the perspective that a woman would be coming from. For example, a friend of mine told me that a genuine fear she has whenever she goes out is the fear of being abducted and being raped. However, as a man, you wouldn't necessarily have that as the forefront of your mind. So us having more conversations about it and having them understand how it makes women feel and how they react to it in terms of psychological reaction and mental reaction and even physical reaction, I think it would advance us moving forward, because I don't think the males in our society fully appreciate or understand the perspective that our women are coming from on this. So in terms of the mindset, that's what I would say. And the second thing is heavily hinged on socialization, how we are socialized in Jamaica. In fact, I think because of our history, we've lost the true meaning and value of family, union, the protecting and respecting of the queen, as one poet would say, because if the queen dies, then ultimately so does the colony. So we have to protect her for the life-sustaining force that she has. And I don't think enough males in our society, enough men in our society understand this. And it's a good thing that we're having this conversation so we can help them to appreciate that it makes women uncomfortable. It really does. And it bothers them tremendously. Even though, and funny enough, some men may even find it amusing, a woman's reaction. But the truth is, when you genuinely understand how it affects her, then you will begin to appreciate that this is not something you do.
Jamar, apart from that, you know, they will cuss you out, you know. Them cuss you back. Don't you, Delia? Them cuss you. I'm happy that you brought up the history and talking a little bit about where we're coming from. Delia, how did we get here? How do we get to the point where this kind of thing is okay?
It's really cultural. It's unfortunate, and of course, not to bash our country. These are issues that are pervasive all over the world, and I think really where it comes from is patriarchy, which says males rule. It says that men are stronger physically. It says in some cases that men are intellectually superior, and all sorts of other views that we tend to have of masculinity generally. And so with that has come over time this kind of feeling that men have, as you have said, rights over nature, over the world, over women's bodies, over their children, whatever it may be. So there is generally this view that men are powerful, strong, and therefore should have their way, right? And so that's where it's really coming from. Different cultures have adapted that to different extents. And so, of course, in this part of the world, in the Western Hemisphere, we don't have as many sort of oppressive legislation against women. We've come very far and compared to some other countries. But deep down, there is still this view that men are in charge, men are powerful, and therefore should have their way. So this is really where it's coming from.
What are some of the factors in society that help to drive this kind of, and I'm going to call it sexual aggression, because sometimes it is downright aggressive. To what extent is music a factor in driving this? What do you think, Jordan?
I mean, there's all facets of society really contribute to it. If you go back to the home environment, sometimes persons are exposed too early to certain sexual orientation that they're naturally not mentally prepared yet for, and they may observe some things in the home, and because of this observation, they grow up with that understanding or misunderstanding that these things are okay. The music that we consume, some lovely music, reggae music, quite lovely, but then if you really go into the deepness of the music, sometimes it's really perpetrating or it's really advocating for some of those stuff, even in our language as well. There are some things that we will downplay, but they're quite offensive. Wagwan baby. Somebody will naturally say that and it come across as a nice greeting or expression, but then it can be offensive to the person who's receiving that. And we don't quickly acknowledge those stuff. So the language is a factor. The music is also a factor, but also the home upbringing, which is where you should really be steering and guiding. And Jamara mentioned it, how that home structure is set up sometimes can be good, or it can be really the contributing factor to what we're seeing today.
Well, we're going to talk some more about the home and those other socializing agents, and of course, the new legislation that was passed earlier this year and what it means. Our expert attorney on set is going to take us through that. We are up on a break, but stay with us, back in a moment.
We are now open and ready to take our women in who are being abused. The facility will accept clients even while we continue to receive donations and build out our programs to help women to rebuild their lives and get back on their feet. I use this opportunity, Madam Speaker, to read out the 24-hour hotline numbers for women who need the shelter. 876-553-0372 or 876-929-2997. The other two properties are now in early reconstruction and or refurbishing stages and will be transformed quickly into safe spaces for women.
This is Inform to Empower, and I have a solid panel of experts with me to discuss sexual harassment and the cultural norms that help to feed it. Delia, I want to go a little deeper into the music. There has been quite a bit of research as well as public discourse about the impact that music has on our sexual aggression and the kind of culture we have as it relates to sexual harassment. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, as you've said, there's lots of research. I haven't done that research, so I usually like to leave that to the experts. But I think that obviously our culture is very steeped in our expressions, of which music is a major one. I do believe that our music mirrors our society. And of course, there's this debate as to whether it's art imitating life or the other way around. But I do think that our music both mirrors and reinforces some of these aggressive tactics, as you have said. But I think it goes deeper than the music. It's really what is feeding the need for such music. And really what feeds it and feeds a lot of the harassment that we have is the need for men to prove their masculinity and to prove their heterosexuality. So it's really coming from a place of Jamaica being extremely homophobic. And as a little boy is old enough to hold up his own head, he has to prove that he likes girls. Okay, and this liking of girls comes out in maybe gentle, romantic ways, but usually comes out in aggressive ways to definitely reinforce and show to the world that I'm a straight man, right? And so you find that the music tends to feed this. It tends to be fed and feed this view that I have to prove that I'm a man, I'm a strong man, I'm a tough man, and I'm a straight man.
So that's that toxic masculinity that we're talking about.
Yes,
it's
it
an
can
element
be.
of it.
It can be very toxic. It doesn't necessarily mean it's starting from a place of toxicity, but definitely it's constantly reinforced. And then, of course, we have other things in the society that aren't helping, that the fact that we're a violent society. So sexual harassment has to be thought of in the context of us being violent. And the music definitely feeds that. It's borrowing from this violence and it's mixing with this toxic masculinity. And so a lot of times we do get this very harmful expression of music, which is enjoyable to listen to, but is reinforcing in the minds that to be a man, you harass.
Yeah. So Jamar, do you feel that that pressure to prove your heterosexuality, as Delia just shared, is that something that you've had that peer pressure?
Personally, no, I haven't, to be honest. However, I do appreciate that our society is overly sexualized. And because of that, it leads a lot of people to experiment, explore, and venture into the world of sex and everything that it entails, including the males in our society who, I agree, will sometimes feel the need to be that dominant figure, that figure who would go and get this girl. However, I'm an optimist, so I genuinely believe that our society can see real change. I think it's a value system that we've managed to creep in. We've managed to erode what we originally had. And when I say originally had, I know that in the context of our history, we came out of families where women were being nurtured. In fact, I was reading a book by a Nobel laureate, G.G. Marquez, and in that book, how it started is 1,000 years of solitude. Or 100 years of solitude, one of it. But in that book, the man was offended because another man chastised him for not impregnating his wife. So he was married for over a year and never bedded his wife one time because of the respect for her that he had. She just never wanted that at that point in time. And I was just blown away by that, to say, look at that. Look at how custom evolved over time. Because now that is just not our reality. But I genuinely believe we could get back there. We could put a greater emphasis on family, a greater emphasis on unions, a greater emphasis on equality in the household, in the workplace, and we could see real change in our society.
So we're going to talk more later on in the conversation about how we actually begin to make inroads and get on that journey to real change. But I think for the purpose of the conversation, we should talk about what harassment is and what we mean. I'm going to shift now into the new legislation that was passed, or the bill that was in the House of Representatives, and how it defines harassment, because there is a certain amount of specificity, Jamar, and if you could help us to define what that harassment is.
The bill is called the Sexual Harassment Bill, so it treats specifically with sexual harassment, and it defines sexual harassment as any unwanted or unwelcome sexual advance. And sexual advance could be gestures, sharing films, catcalling, even in the workplace, and the bill doesn't confine it to the workplace. So if you rent somebody premises, you could genuinely be harassing that person. If the person is a subcontractor, if the person is a potential employee and not necessarily engaged, if the person is a ward of the state in an institution like a nursing home, a medical facility, or a school, the legislation is broad enough to capture that. But really treat sexual harassment as unwanted sexual advance. So any unwanted sexual advance that makes the person feel uncomfortable.
So I noticed that you mentioned a few areas, and I also looked at the legislation as well. It wasn't as legalese as others have been, so I was able to go through, but I did not see, however, any reference to things that I would have experienced. So if I'm not in a place of work, suppose I just going down to the supermarket, and somebody on the road is saying something that is derogatory or offensive and makes me feel uncomfortable. Does the law cover that as well?
The law does cover that, but not necessarily in this legislation. It covers it in the sense that for you to apprehend any immediate and unlawful personal violence is an assault on your person. I know in Jamaica we tend to use assault as synonymous with being battered in some way. But if you apprehend immediate and unlawful personal violence, that is an assault on your person. So in that sense, the law would treat with it. It's just that, as you know, most cases would not be reported.
Right.
For the sexual harassment bill, though, it's not quite the same, and I suppose it probably would be more difficult for the legislators to pass legislation to capture every possible aspect. But I think this is a good step for Jamaica in terms of what the legislation provides for. And I think we're advancing as a pioneering country in the region on this.
So we've heard quite a bit of conversation in the public domain about the law. And one of the questions is, and one of the comments would be that it doesn't go far enough. What do you think?
No, I think this legislation is very far-reaching. And I think it requires a lot from institutions and employers. For example, once the legislation is enacted, every employer or institution in this country must have a written sexual harassment policy within 12 months. And what the ministry has, it is empowered to appoint officers, designated officers, who can go in any establishment and check that establishment to see whether or not they're acting in accordance with the legislation. More importantly, if a worker brings a complaint to an institution or to an employer, and that employer does nothing, that employer can be liable for that action, and liable in the sense that they can also be ordered to pay compensation to that worker. So I think the legislation is far-reaching. It sets up a different tribunal altogether to treat with sexual harassment claims, so you have some sense of confidence and not necessarily having to wait for the justice system as it is now. So I think this legislation is far-reaching, and it will advance our claim and our case for gender equality and the reduction of gender-based violence as we know it in our society. Because the workplace, believe it or not, is a big subset of our society.
Yeah.
And I think capturing the workplace and institutions will make the legislation very, very far-reaching.
Judon, you're a board director of the Caribbean Society for Human Resources. What has the legislation in Jamaica, what impact has it had on the conversations, the plans, and how you as an organization will be approaching sexual harassment in the workplace?
I mean, very good question. So the C#, as we call ourselves, we're very, very keen on developing policy or helping to shape policy. When we looked at the Jamaican legislation, we did some comparisons with other Caribbean states. For instance, St. Lucia, Anguilla, those countries, they made sexual harassment also a criminal offense.
Okay.
So this is one of the highlights that we took from what's happening elsewhere in the Caribbean, but also in Jamaica. So yes, the Jamaican legislation brings us to a new space where we can, really be very clear as organizations what are unwanted behaviors, and being very clear to everyone that, hey, these unwanted behaviors no matter what level of the organization they are not acceptable, and there is zero tolerance towards that. So our advocacy will come through from the standpoint of, okay, from the people perspective, everyone being aware that these things are important and that we must respect it. And then from the work and the workplace perspective is ensuring that we support organizations, whether it be policy development or whether it be just clarification, sensitization. Because a key part of the legislative framework is that quite often the cultural or behavior shift that is required is not fast enough or not deep enough. So we want to play a role where that is concerned to ensure that employers and HR practitioners across the region fully aware and that they're able to drive a framework that allows for clear awareness and embedding of what we believe are good practices that would prevent or totally eliminate the sexual harassment in the workplace.
In terms of policy development, because as our attorney on the panel just explained, the law says that now every employer has to have workplace policy. What kind of support is being given locally to ensure that all our employers, first of all, that awareness happens and then lead to policy development and implementation?
I think good employers shouldn't wait on getting something from the government usually. It's very clear in the legislation what is expected and required. So employers have to, consult with their legal team or with their HR professionals and ensure that we put these policies in place. Development can come through from C-Sharp, but it can also come through different elements. The Bureau of Gender Affairs, the Institute of Gender, that Belle is a part of, can also help organizations to really shape that policy that reflects something that is modern, but it also inspires the confidence that, hey, it's not just complying with the legislation, but it's ensuring that it meets a standard that persons can feel confident that if something does happen that is outside of this policy, there can be some way that there's redress.
So it seems as if HR practitioners have embraced the new legislation.
Definitely. I know many organizations in Jamaica already would have had policy around sexual harassment. It's something that has been in dialogue for many years. I remember my first venture into HR, it was a big topic. I went to quite a few seminars addressing sexual harassment. So I think companies have already put in place. What is now required is to making sure that it meets the new stipulations that has been presented in this updated act.
I noted at one point it would be that sexual harassment was only if it was the offender was a superior. It would have to be your boss or somebody who could make decisions about your career. But now it could just be a regular co-worker, right?
Yeah, man, it could be anyone. It doesn't even have to be a co-worker. It could be a subcontractor. It could be a volunteer. Could be.
So the onus then would be on the employer to make sure that the environment that you're working in is safe.
The employer can also be harassed. So it's within their best interest to ensure that they have policies that will protect them as well.
And just to highlight, Stacey, that's the duty required and outlined in the legislation, the duty to create an environment free from sexual harassment. So that's the duty that the employers and leaders of the institutions have.
Do you see many cases coming forward, Jordan, in Jamaica, across the region, of sexual harassment that actually get to a point where you go to court about it? Because I haven't heard of many instances that actually get to the courts. Do we see that happening?
Not as much. If you kind of step back and look at what happened over the last couple of years with the Me Too movement, it kind of brought a lot of sensitization in the Caribbean around, this is an important thing. And many years later, somebody can actually bring a claim around these sort of instances. The Jamaican legislation, I know there was a big debate whether it was 12 months, it was too short for somebody to report, and they have extended that to 6 years. I mean, that will give persons enough time to acknowledge, accept, and then prepare themselves. But it's not a situation where it is well articulated, and usually these things are more private. One, to protect the person who's usually making the report, are expressing that there have been some unwanted sexual advances. And so it's quite a private matter as it is now. But I think as we evolve as a society and persons become much more aware and much more clearer that it's no longer a power thing, where the person who has power can now step over or downplay what can naturally become a very public thing. I think more and more as companies, as organizations become more aware that this thing can really impact your bottom line. As with any other financial decision, you will see that the
greater care
being established.
All right, we are definitely having a great conversation here, and just reminding persons on Zoom or webinar attendees, please put your questions in the chat, your comments in the chat. We do have a team that is responding and will continue to field your questions. We have to take another quick break. We are definitely stronger together. Soon come back. I'm Stacey Ann, and I have with me attorney Jamar Clark, Dr. Delia Bean, a lecturer at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the UWI Mona, and Judan Bowden, board director of the Caribbean Society for Human Resources. And we're talking about sexual harassment and aspects of our culture that contribute to gender-based violence. For our webinar participants on Zoom, remember to put your questions and comments in the chat, and our Stronger Together team will respond. Amar, I'm gonna go back to something that Jordan said just before the break. I had asked if we have seen many cases come to the courts of sexual harassment claims. Do you think the legislation will bring about more of those cases?
100%. In fact, I think the legislation will create a whole different structure in terms of treating with sexual harassment. What I'd say in terms of the prevalence of the cases before is they tend to be resolved internally. And it's quite interesting because now what can happen is a complainant can literally take their complaint to this newly established sexual harassment tribunal, when what would have occurred in the past was that the employer would have had the duty to investigate that sexual harassment and ensure that it imposes whatever disciplinary sanction it imposes.
And if it's your employer harassing you, you're kind of dark.
It would be more difficult. But in any event, an employer has a common law duty. So without even legislation, an employer does have a common law duty to provide a safe place of work. And that would necessarily mean a place of work free from sexual harassment. So arguably you could bring a claim for a breach of employer's duty if the employer failed to do that. However, I don't think we've seen many of those. Most of the cases we've seen are employees who've, for one reason or the other, got dismissed for a case of sexual harassment, and they're either challenging that decision to say that they ought not to have been dismissed or something to that effect. But we haven't seen cases of persons who have been victims of sexual harassment coming forward and bringing a case. And this is what this new bill intends to do in a very, very serious way. So I think we will definitely see a greater number of cases coming forward and being dealt with by this tribunal.
So the law requires that once there is an allegation or an accusation or a claim of sexual harassment, that you go to an external party. Do you go to the police, or as you mentioned, a tribunal that you would go to make your case?
Well, the first necessary step would be to report it, because the legislation also has, even though it can be bypassed, the legislation has a requirement for a complainant or a victim to exhaust local options. So you have to exhaust internal mechanisms that are set up in place that are required under the legislation to treat with it. And if there's a failure of that internal mechanism, then you can advance that complaint to the tribunal once it is set up. Or in the alternative, where you've exhausted those options and you still feel dissatisfied, you can advance your claim to the tribunal. So that's how it really is supposed to work. The consequences for the employer in that situation is if the employer fails to act because there are detailed requirements for the employer or the institution, including investigating the matter, informing the person who the complaint was made against of the complaint within a specific period of time. I think it's for the workplace is 2 days.
2 days, that's all.
So, yeah, so these requirements, and it has to be, the complaint must be noted in writing. The employer is required to keep a register maintaining all the sexual harassment claims that were prepared and the detailed assessment and whatever measure the employer implemented to resolve this sexual harassment issue. So it creates a greater onus on the employer or the institution. And if there's any failure on the part of the employer, the ward of the institution or the whatever facility, then there can be far-reaching consequences for that institution if that complainant takes the matter to this new tribunal that should be set up.
So we hope that more people will feel empowered, but Delia, that will require a little more than just legislation, not true?
Definitely. In fact, as I was listening, I was thinking, you know, it's good to have these things on paper, but to think about being harassed, having had that happen to you, and going through all the steps to relive what took place, to have to keep reporting it over and over, to put it in writing, to have persons, you know, either further abuse you or give you a side eye, or, you know, things that happen in the workplace. Sometimes these workplaces are small. Once you make a report, everyone knows, you know. So going through the steps legislatively, they're important. But the day-to-day act of going through this for days, weeks, or months can really be traumatic to persons who have to go through this type of situation. And so it really takes, it will take a lot of public sensitization. It will take a lot of provision for counseling, and just to get people to want to do this. They really just can't bother, you know what I mean? Especially if it's something verbal, and you feel, oh, it's part of the culture, it's just so it goes, somebody tell me something about my parts. Yeah. So what? You know, you really may not want to go through all of that. It may have to get a little bit more severe where you feel like your job was threatened, your livelihood, or you were physically assaulted. So we have to change too the culture of thinking that harassment has to be physical or life-threatening or wage-threatening before you actually do something about it. And we also need to make sure that the mechanisms internally are easy. Because, I mean, not so easy that the alleged perpetrator doesn't get their time too to counter a claim, because of course we do have to have that in
Natural
place.
Justice.
Right. But generally just to make it not the most difficult process so that people will actually want to take this on.
Yeah. I recall many years ago, and this is now about perception and that mindset. Sometimes people will say, you know, where you going to suffer? You know, it's not like it's a big thing and I didn't touch you. I mean, many years ago, I was in a newsroom. I will not say what newsroom. And there was a colleague who commented on another reporter's breasts, and him tell her, your breasts them look stiff. And she was livid, rightly so. And he was just like, what did I do? I was complimenting you. And I at first, I thought he was joking. Because I'm like, are you serious? Yeah. And he was at a loss. He was like, why are you upset? And so this is the mindset that we will have to shift. I mean, how do we do that as a society? Where do we start? Because of course, there are many people who know that that kind of thing is inappropriate, but there are lots of other people who don't. Where do we begin? Delia.
Me? Oh. Well, I think we begin with socialization. That's really important. It does begin in the home. We have to start to teach our boys differently. Again, we tend to raise our boys to have these outward expressions. You know, that you must be vocal, you must be heard, you must be seen, which is fine, but you don't have to be heard and seen in that type of negative way. But we also, for the grown folk, you know, we have to do a lot of constant reinforcement of of other types of behaviors to make men and women, because even in classes and so on, when you do training, you hear women say, if men don't comment on me, I don't feel like I look good that morning. So it's not really only about what men are doing, but the expectation that some women have. And that's why it's important that, as we've heard, the legislation says unwanted. Right. So if the comment is wanted, that's not harassment. But what you may want is very different from what I may want in the same space. And so men may say, I'm confused because I said to Stacey and she looked good and she liked it, and I said it to Dale and Dale taking me to court. So, there is this kind of confusion, but it's really about saying to those who would perpetrate this, read the room, know your audience, and don't think that you are entitled to say anything to anyone from the start, even if you like the comment. You're not entitled. You don't have a right. Yeah. Right? So we have to start there.
And I think that's a very good point to make. Jamara, I want to ask you, pick up on a point that Delia raised. It's about what is unwanted. Reading the room, what does the law say about that unwanted aspect of it? I mean, it's tricky to navigate, isn't it?
It is, but the thing is, it is subject to the person who is the victim. So if the person feels as though it is unwanted, then by all means it will be unwanted, because she or he did not appreciate the comment. But if it is something, if it's a type of exchange that you engage in on a regular, and it is fine with the person and the person is fine with whatever you say, then it wouldn't fall into the category of unwanted for it to be deemed sexual harassment. Obviously, because the person wouldn't necessarily complain about it. But as was mentioned.
And that's a problem.
I notice you say he, because it's possible for women to be charged under this legislation. Yes. I'll let you jump in, and I think Jordan wanted to say something. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say that's problematic, because a lot of times as women, we are all, again, going back to socialization, we are socialized to accept these things. We can't be bothered. We grow up from you start to 9, 10, you know that these things are going to come at you. The fact that I don't complain about it doesn't mean I want it, but I don't want to make a scene. And so women who constantly make a scene, they get labeled all sorts of names.
I know.
In organizations. Oh, they can't get ahead. Nobody wants to invite them out. It's a whole thing. It can affect your productivity if you are seen as this person who's negative and combative. So Dela may just relax and say, and take it. It doesn't mean that it's not unwanted. Yeah. So that makes it very challenging.
True, I agree. That is a blurred line, and I don't mean to, but that is a blurred line, and it's very difficult to navigate. But I think what the employers will have to do, or the institutions will have to do in those circumstances, encourage the person to come forward.
Yes, you have to
feel free to come forward without any fear of any sort of victimization. And you're correct, because you outlined earlier before, and I really wanted to touch on this, that the situation is sometimes it's difficult for people to rehash this story over and over. So let's say you rehash it internally for the purposes of a disciplinary proceeding, but the worker complained about it. So now you have to rehash it to another tribunal. And what if it advances further? You have to rehash it again. And this sometimes happens a year, 2 years after the situation. So that also feeds into people wanting to not necessarily pursue it, not necessarily wanting to complain. But we have to just ensure that they feel as though it is a safe space where you can make this complaint, you can even make it and make it in confidence, because the legislation requires for it to be in confidence. And it's a criminal offense for it to be disclosed other than in accordance with the legislation. So I suppose they try to protect it or try to make it so that there is a balance, but it's difficult to strike.
Jordan, you wanted to comment?
I wanted to look at it also from the workplace perspective, because the unwanted, unwelcome, if we detain ourselves where that is concerned, we may lose a lot of the other employees. So yes, employee A may want that sort of thing. Because I remember even in the debate in Parliament, there was one particular MP that said, she will no longer experience that catcalling that makes her feel well and special on the day. But I'm saying from an employer perspective, it may be welcomed by one, but it may be offensive to several others. So we have to make the blanket as broad as possible to say, you know what, when it comes to sexual harassment, these are undesirable behaviors. And you may be directing it to employee A, but it offends quite a number of other employees. And you don't want that.
And it makes them feel uncomfortable.
Them feel uncomfortable. So, and while legislation speaks to the victim and the accused, the employer have a greater responsibility to protect everyone in the workplace. So I may feel offended, you may not, but at the end of the day, we should be saying, hey, these are unwelcome behaviors, so we will not tolerate, whether you want it, yes or no.
And it's just to say that there are some things that don't have any place on the job, in the workplace.
Yeah.
You have to be commenting on somebody's body, somebody's person. I mean, I laugh now because it was a story that was shared about somebody who said to this coworker, your bottom run like 0. Like, I mean, everybody laughed at the time because it sounded funny, but I mean, why? Why would you feel the need to be commenting on somebody's body, And if we can get to the point where we can understand that some things just do not have a place, then I think we will be in a much better place. We are going to talk a little bit more about the enforcement of the legislation. We do have an inspector from the Jamaica Constabulary Force who's going to join us in a little bit. But I know, Judan, you have to go, so I'm going to give you the last word in this segment.
All right, thank you, Stacey. But really a pleasure to be a part of the discussion. Good legal perspective, good gender perspective. But I want to encourage everyone, employers, employees, observers of these practices to, really call them out. It's all about respecting ourselves and respecting each other. That's where it really starts. And I know we have a lot of work to do as a society, but I think if each individual, institution, employer begins that journey, be very clear that, hey, these are undesirable behaviors. These are behaviors that we do not endorse or we do not condone, and there's a zero tolerance towards them. I think that will start us on the journey that we need to be.
Thank you so very much. Very well said.
Yeah, thank you.
And we are going to take a break now, but for sure, we are definitely stronger together. We are stronger together, tackling this monster called gender-based violence. I'm Stacey Ann Smith, moderator for this panel discussion, which is part of a 3-webinar series dubbed Inform to Empower. November 25 is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and Girls, and we're starting the dialogue today in the hope that we can change the narrative and take action to turn this thing around. This series of webinars is powered by the U.S. Embassy in Kingston, Danrak Productions, and Belle Media. And we're happy to announce that with the kind support of the U.S. government, we will be able to provide free counseling. I did say free counseling for 25 persons who have been impacted by gender-based violence. For our participants on Zoom, please check the chat for a link to a survey through which you can indicate your interest in signing up for these free counseling sessions. In this half of the conversation, we're welcoming a new panelist to the discussion, Inspector Sean J. Mitchell of the Jamaica Constabulary Force, the communications unit, the Constabulary Communications Unit. Did I get that right?
Yes, you did.
CCU, right?
CCU, definitely.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us, Inspector Mitchell. And of course, we still have with us Attorney Jamar Clark and gender specialist Dr. Delia Bean, who is a wealth of information. Before the break, we were talking about the cultural norms that support harassment and how those things lead to gender-based violence. The case for change has definitely been made. Inspector Mitchell, do the police have a role to play in bringing about this cultural shift? I'm going to start there, and then we're going to go into looking at the new bill and our readiness, your readiness as a force for dealing with that. But first, I want to get some comments from you about the culture of sexual harassment.
Certainly. So the constabulary force does have a mandate to serve, protect, and to reassure, and we stand by that mandate. So the constabulary force operates on a reporting mechanism. So once reports come to the police, we have a responsibility to act on those reports. And if that's our role in this in this new dispensation, then we intend to carry out our mandate. So for example, if a report comes to the police and we do our investigations and it warrants further investigations, then we will act on that. Once a statement is then collected and the individual wishes to press charges in relation to whatever the matter is, then we will lay charges and so forth. But outside of that, the constabulary force does have a responsibility to educate as well. So we are
with community policing and that kind of thing?
Right, so community policing, we do use our social media platforms as well to educate members of the public about how we can be a part of this process to help them and to get them to a space where they are more comfortable coming to the police to report matters like this.
So Jamar was sharing earlier about the new legislation and the fact that there is a tribunal now. So from an employee-employer workplace standpoint, something happens, let's use a workplace as an example, and you have the option of going to your employer, making a complaint. There's a system set up for your employer to receive that complaint, and you have a tribunal. But there's also the need for you to report it to the police. So my question is, the legislation is new. We understand that the regulations are still being worked on. So until that happens, how will the police treat those reports that come in for sexual harassment?
So right, so given the fact that there's the act is not operational as yet, then we have to look at other pieces of legislation and see how those reports fit into those other pieces of legislation, and then we can act in that regard. Remember now, the constabulary force is an organization that has to use the pieces of legislation available to it in order for it to act in any matter at all. So we can't just arrest under the Sexual Harassment Act when it's not operational as yet. So we have to look into the reports, what's in the report, the points to prove whatever offense may be there, and then we use the legislations that we have on the books now to go forward with that report.
So in terms of the laws that currently exist, I mean, we've already established that the sexual harassment legislation hasn't been gazetted yet. And as you say, you have to have actual laws that are in operation in order to move. And I'll give you a quick example. So very recently, a much older man in my community said something to my 17-year-old that made her very uncomfortable. It's happened before, and we decided, hey, guess what? We're gonna go to the police to report it. And the district constable, a female district constable, wasn't quite sure, how to treat with the matter. And as you're explaining, it could well be because we don't have that law in operation.
Right, it could be a case where there's no legislation that covers that particular comment that he made at your 17-year-old. So we have to look at other pieces of legislation, Offences Against the Persons Act, that covers threats and other activities that may warrant a police investigation. So we have to look at what we have available before we can proceed with acting. In terms of other aspects of gender-based violence, we look at the Domestic Violence Act. So that is a piece of legislation that we have at our disposal that we can use. And over the years, the police have established several domestic violence intervention centers. And we call them our DVI care centers.
Okay.
And the first role of a DVI care center is intervention. And then we move to counseling, then we move to awareness, response, and then empathy. So it's a systematic approach of dealing with gender-based violence. But as it relates to this sexual harassment, we don't have a dedicated legislation operational as yet for us to use that.
So it really comes down to your making a determination on that specific case and looking at other legislation that you have that you can pull on. I think Jamar mentioned earlier in the discussion that it doesn't necessarily have to be the sexual harassment legislation, but there are other laws. Which one did you mention, Jamar, that speaks to if you feel assaulted?
Well, yes, I was specifically to respond to you, I was talking about assault generally under common law, that it could fall under assault, because if you apprehend immediate and unlawful personal violence, and that's reasonable, there could genuinely be a claim for assault. It's just that you may not see those matters being reported. And in terms of the sexual harassment bill, I don't think it would be a bill that would create criminal sanctions for individuals so as to have the police reporting it or the police investigating it and laying charges. However, it could very well evolve to that, because as you very well know, sexual harassment could involve some sort of conduct that falls squarely within one of the offenses in the Sexual Offences Act or the Domestic Violence Act, as the inspector mentioned. So, and these are criminal legislations that can bring with it punitive sanctions such as jail time.
Right.
As opposed to the sexual harassment bill, which is really seeking redress, and the redress is usually in the form of compensation or reinstatement of the worker in the workplace, or some sort of punitive sanction on the employer to ensure that they create a safe place of work free from sexual harassment. The only criminal sanctions that the legislation really contemplates would be for failure to adhere to the legislation, like an employer failing to have the policy in place. Arguably, the police could come in and charge them under the legislation for failure to adhere to what the sexual harassment bill would have outlined. Or if it is that the tribunal imposes an award and that award is not dutifully carried out by the employer, that could lead to criminal sanctions as well. But generally, the legislation is really primarily concerned with civil redress and not so much criminal redress. However, I would also like to mention that the police force is really the first point of contact, even for employers, because if the sexual harassment complaint is of such a nature that it goes way beyond what is prescribed internally in company policy, that employer, to my mind, would have a duty to report it to the police for greater investigation to be conducted on that matter. That could very well lead to other criminal charges, separate and apart from the sexual harassment complaint within the workplace.
Right.
I'm going to ask Inspector Mitchell to talk more about that process, but you mentioned something that got me thinking when you talked about punitive measures. Are we waiting for the regulations before we know, like, what kinds of fines are we talking about, or do we know exactly what the law?
There are some fines mentioned in the legislation, like I think the fine for failure to have the policy is $500,000. There's another one for
mean Jamaican?
Yeah, Jamaican dollars. And another one for failure to appear before the tribunal. I think that fine is $1 million. So there are fines for failure to act, and I think these fines are the higher end of the spectrum. So it's the threshold could very well be less, much like the COVID-19 fines, the fines under the disaster risk management orders, where you can be fined up to $1 million.
Yeah.
But the judge would have the discretion to determine what fine is imposed based on the activity.
You were talking earlier, Inspector Mitchell, about the DVI centers, the intervention that goes on. It makes me think that you're probably shifting from this long-held belief that the police don't get involved in man and woman business. Time gone by, you call them and them come and say, oh, it's a man and him lady, and you just say, all right, just kiss and make up and keep it moving. So there has been a shift.
Definitely. So we recognize that there was an issue, there was a gap. And since the start of the year, we've trained approximately 652 officers in domestic violence training. So we have officers now who are basically training other officers. So we have train-the-trainer programs where we bring them in, we get them through a process of sensitization with different entities coming in, and they are now training other officers to deal with matters of domestic violence. And in addition to that, we have established approximately 10 domestic violence intervention centers. And these centers now are staffed by members of the clergy, they're staffed by trained counselors and other members of the community. So once a case of domestic violence is reported to us, we do our investigations, we collect a report, and the person who's reporting does not wish to give a statement, because we have to establish that the police cannot make an arrest unless there is a statement on file indicating, and then we look at the points to prove the offense, and then we proceed with arresting that individual. So if there's no intention to give a statement, then we refer the matter now to the Domestic Violence Intervention Center, and the center manager now takes that matter and have the parties come in. And as I mentioned, the first thing is about the intervention. So we try to intervene in what's happening.
To de-escalate.
To de-escalate, right. And then we move to counseling, awareness now, and that's for our members as well. And the response mechanism now could be a combination of, it could very well be a punitive response based on what's happening in the center, because the person can change his or her mind and give a statement, and then we can respond punitively. And then we talk about empathy. So we have to have persons that are empathizing with the victim in this particular matter. And outside of that, the response could also recommend that the individual goes to the court to take out a protection order or an occupation order in order to safeguard themselves.
So I want to also ask you a little bit more, but I'm getting the wrap signal from my producer. We do have to take a quick break, but when I come back, I want to delve a little more into that sensitization and the resources that you have as a force, because you mentioned 650, I think, but your membership is much larger than that, you know? I mean, so when we come back, we talk more about if we are in fact going far enough. All right?
Sure.
Stay with us. This is Stronger Together, Informed to Empower, tackling gender-based violence. Soon come back. Inform to Empower. That's our mission today. I'm Stacey Ann Smith, and my guests are Jamar Clark, Dr. Delia Bean, and Inspector Sean J. Mitchell. And we've been talking about sexual harassment and how we can begin to make changes for the best protection of our women and girls. Right before the break, Inspector Mitchell, I raised the point that you had touched on about resources. And the fact that you mentioned that there are maybe 600 and something members of the force who were trained, but when you compare that to the full force, does that go far enough though, especially for this issue that is so important?
Right, so just to make a clarification to that point, 650 this year.
Okay.
Right, but essentially the constabulary force has a vast number of sections and departments. And ideally, we're training persons who are interacting with members of the public on a daily basis. So for example, persons working at the police stations. And it's an ongoing training process. So we are not quite there yet, but we are getting there with the training process. So it's a targeted approach to get members who will interface with other members of the public on a daily basis, to get them that type of training. And the training takes into account how can they recognize that this is a domestic violence issue? How do they respond to this issue? And when do they make the referral to the Domestic Violence Intervention Center? So that's basically a synopsis of what the training entails. So to identify it, the actions to take, and how to make a referral to domestic violence intervention centers.
So in instances now where there is a clear case of assault, you perhaps, go to a scene where police have been called, somebody's there beaten and bloodied, but does not want to or is afraid to make a report. What do you do?
Well, we can't force anybody to make a report or to give a statement, but we can encourage them. We can start by providing some amount of comfort through our community safety and security branch. So these officers are trained to deal with members of the community, and they know a certain level of empathy to show to members of the community. So we can encourage persons to come in and make a report and give a statement as well. But we can't force anybody to give a statement. If the offense or whatever was happening happened in the presence and view of the police, then that's a different affair. The police make arrests on 3 different points. 1, information from a third person, that's a statement. 2, a warrant. And 3, the offense was committed within the view and presence of the police.
Okay.
So if we were on location and we saw what was happening, then we can act without the victim coming forward to give a statement, because we would have seen the incident taking place. But generally speaking, we can't force a member of the public to give a statement or make a report to the police.
So that's something that I've always had an issue with personally, because if you're in a situation where it gets violent, and in many times daily, as you know, it's something that's happening over time, and the police come, and it's obvious that something has happened to you. But because somebody might be fearful and is not willing to go to the police station for a number of reasons to report it, then you just, say, well, you have to report it, and if you can't, then you walk away and you leave them in a potentially dangerous situation, sometimes even deadly.
As I said, we can encourage the person to come with us, come to the station, make a report. If not, we do have communication with other centers within Jamaica, such as the Women's Center, though we can make referrals to those other areas for support. So it's not just about the punitive action of the police, but we also make referrals to other departments that we get. There are stakeholders in this fight, and we are in constant dialogue with them. So we can encourage someone to make contact with this unit. If you do not wish to come to the police station, here's another option that you can use. But that's basically the sum total of what we can do based on how the legislation is set up and how the police force operates.
How do you deal with cases or allegations of harassment or assault by police officers themselves? And I was sharing with you before that I have been a victim of harassment. I've walked out of the gas station, walked into my car, policeman, blue flashing lights, pull me over. Why are you stopping me? Because I wanted to meet you. And him started this and that, and I'm like, are you for real? And at this point, I begin to feel fearful because this person represents power. He has rights, and I mean, the law gives him greater power on the road than I do. And normally, I would have just sort him out if he's a regular person on the road, but now him have a weapon and him have blue lights, and I'm now wondering, can I really tell him to go and have a seat over there? Or, you have to tread lightly. I mean, how do you manage those reports? And I mean, what do women do? I mean, if you're on the road and a policeman stops you to look you, what do you do?
Right. Once we get those reports, and I must say, the Constabulary Force has set up in recent times an Inspectorate and Professional Standards Oversight Bureau. It's our internal inspectorate arm that does investigations of any type of allegations against any of our members. It's a very robust department that is staffed by very high quality investigators. And these officers, once we get the report, and let me tell you, the Constabulary Force is probably one of the organizations that have the most policies in terms of how we deal with members of the public, internal disciplinary procedures. And the police public interaction policy is one such policy that we can use to levy sanctions against these members. So if you are stopped by an officer and the interaction is not a professional interaction in terms of maybe a breach or some other professional interaction, and you feel uncomfortable, please do not hesitate to make a report to our inspectorate.
Me never reported.
And once you make the report, it's guaranteed it will be investigated and the officer will be contacted and asked to give an account as to his actions on the road.
In my mind, it's going to, at the time, I'm just going to go through this process where you're going to have to fill out this report, and it's long and laborious. I see Daly over here nodding. I mean, and it's the same we were talking about earlier about those cases of harassment. Sometimes
but we
just can't bother.
We want you to come forward so we can fix the problem. So if we don't know that the issue is happening, then we can't really address it. We can't address those individual officers. So while we have internal training happening, those individual cases that we can be punitive with and make an example out of, we need persons to come forward and say, this has been happening to me, or this has happened to me, and I am not comfortable. And once we get those reports, we will act on those reports.
So the key is to speak up.
Yes,
it is to speak up, and it's to say, you know, I'm not comfortable with this. And I think we started talking about it earlier, Delia, about this mindset change and women feeling empowered, women and men feeling empowered to hold up your hand and say, miss, I don't like this, you know? How do we start that process though, you know, of shifting into where people feel empowered to say, you know, I didn't like that?
Right, so breaking the silence is really one of the major tools that most activist groups use. So you'll find a lot of campaigns across the Caribbean, across the region, and even globally are about speaking out. And I think that the more that we do that, the better we'll be. So, but one of the things I notice, even when speaking about the constabulary or other arms of our social services, it's about communicating with the public more. So, for instance, I don't really know that I've seen a lot of ads from the constabulary or even bureaus and other organizations that deal with these matters to say, if this happens to you, this is what you do. I think we need a lot more campaigns, you know, billboards, social media, traditional media, so that persons know that there's a unit, there's a number, there's somewhere I can call. You know, we tend to use the social media now a lot in comments, and, you know, we tend to communicate it that way. But I think we need some more formal channels where people know not only that they should speak up, but where they can speak out. And I think once we're able to do that, once we're able to get these phone numbers out in the public consciousness, then when you recount that incident to a friend, they will say, but you know, you can call so and so and so. You know, we need to have these things where every sector of society knows that you can get redress, you can actually do something about this thing that has happened to you. Because a lot of cases, there are lots of cases like that, where maybe not the police force, but persons with power, persons who, you know, when police pull you over, if you have a run-in with a soldier or something, you instantly feel a little, you know, you're on guard, because they don't usually stop you for anything good. You know, so you have to recognize the power dynamic in that situation and give people all the tools to respectfully deal with it, you know, without causing an altercation. And we can't do that if we don't have public information.
Yeah, knowledge is power, right? And Jamar, when we talk about just creating that shift and making sure people know what's happening in terms of the regulations that go with the new legislation, fingers crossed that it doesn't take another many years before it's a reality. But until that happens, how do we arm ourselves with the information? How do we make sure we know what the law says and being able to defend those rights that have been given?
I think it starts with us disseminating the information. So it starts with this right here, us talking about it, helping people to understand what happens better, help people to understand avenues by which you can lodge a complaint. And I think gender-based violence is a subset of a plethora of issues we have here in Jamaica. And I think us addressing those issues will, in turn, resolve or reduce a lot of the gender-based violence and issues surrounding the administration of justice and how justice is dispensed. Because another reason people don't complain is because they feel as though nothing will happen. What will happen? I will go to court 20, 30 times before I get a result. Should I go to court 30 times in 5 years before I get a result? Should I wait that long? No. Should I put myself through that?
That's
Should
what
I
I thought.
inconvenience myself?
Can't bother,
People won't. So you have to have a sense that justice will prevail. the administration of justice works, to put back confidence in the justice system. I mean, there is confidence in the justice system, but I think we could do a lot more in that regard. And if we had more persons being either convicted or charged or found liable in some way for sexual harassment, I think that would be a great deterrent in Jamaicans avoiding that type of behavior. And I use the example of a stop sign. When Jamaicans go abroad, they will stop at every single stop sign. But in Jamaica, it's almost as if a stop sign doesn't exist, which suggests to my mind that we can conform. We choose not to. And we choose not to because the enforcement mechanism is not one in which you feel as though if you don't, there will be consequences for your actions. And I think if we do that, along with the communication sensitization and the conversation that should be ongoing, I think we will see some real change real fast.
Yeah,
but we would have to do this.
Made a good point about enforcement and the justice system because, as I said, for me, it's gonna take too long. I don't have time to go to court 17 times in 2 years. By the time we get to court, I forget what happened, So it's important that each segment of society, each arm, I mean, you talked about justice system. We also talked about information, making sure that people know what to do and where to go. Inspector Mitchell, from a communication standpoint, because I know that that's a big part of your role, how do you ensure, and through what avenues? Is it P-STEP, for instance? Is it your CCU? I mean, how do you use your own internal channels to make sure that the people you serve and protect know their rights and know where to go? Because it was just in doing the background for this conversation, I learned about the domestic violence intervention centers. I had not heard of them before.
Right. So we did have social media blitz on the vaccine, sorry, I was about to say vaccine. Right, on the domestic violence intervention centers. One of the things is that we need to be a little more consistent with our messaging on particular issues. So for example, once we publish the information, it's good to always publish and republish. But our website does have a wealth of information on it, www.jcf.gov.jm, where we have information about our domestic violence intervention centers, the numbers for the centers, where the centers are located, and the potential or the prospects for new centers opening across Jamaica. Right now, not all parishes are serviced by these centers, but there are plans afoot to have a domestic violence center in every parish. Some parish will have 2 or 3, depending on what's happening there. So for example, St. Thomas does have 2 domestic violence intervention centers. And it's one of the reasons why we have 2 in that parish is because we do get a lot of reports of DVI cases in St. Thomas. So our mechanisms really to use our social media platforms to get the information out there. We do have a large following on our social media platforms, and we do use it to get information out there. Maybe we need to do a lot more in terms of this type of communication, so that members of the public are aware that if this happens to you and it involves a police officer, please call this number or reach out via WhatsApp to this line. If it's a case where it's a domestic violence matter, you can reach out to this domestic violence intervention center. It's the closest one to you. So we probably need to have that type of communication going on more consistently.
All right, we're going to talk a little more about, on the individual level now, more about civil society and what families, parents can do. But we're going to take a very quick break and come back. It's Stronger Together, Inform to Empower. Welcome back. It's our final segment in this panel discussion on sexual harassment. It's Stronger Together, Informing to Empower, as we tackle gender-based violence, the ongoing pandemic. This conversation is focused on those factors, those cultural norms that help to feed gender-based violence. We've been talking for the better part of an hour or a little bit more than that on what causes, gender-based violence, the mindset, looking at the sexual harassment legislation. And in these next few minutes, I want us to zero in on the role that each of us can play. Let's start with you, Delia, looking at that first unit, that family, and how we can begin to re-socialize our people.
Right, so that's a very good place to start because, of course, a lot of violence does take place in the family. Unfortunately, this is a space that should be the safest and most welcoming and nurturing. And of course, we do know that a lot of violence takes place in these spaces. So I think first, it's before even re-socialization, it's really about tackling what's causing certain violent acts. And of course, when we speak about violence, we don't only mean physical, we also mean psychological, we mean, verbal, and so on and so forth. So it's about, when we tend to say, like, I think there are new thrusts towards parenting, but I think parents need, and partners need instruction, need, how to mediate conflicts in families, how to deal with financial strain and other things that take place within the family unit. So it's really about giving some active instruction to persons, to adults in particular, to teach children at school. How do you speak to your parents? How do you speak to your siblings? Things that we take for granted, but these socio-emotional skills shouldn't be taken for granted. So tackling the violence there, and then, as you've said, re-socializing.
I want to give each of you a final word as we wrap up the conversation. I'm going to start with Jamar.
To close, I'd say we have come a far way, and there's still a long way to go. But I think if we continue to work together, if we continue to have the conversation, if we continue to ensure that everybody understands what it is we're trying to accomplish, what it is we're trying to rid our society of, and the ways in which we can go about it, particularly the socialization of our people, because I'm sure we're all aware of persons who've been involved in relationships or have in some way experienced sexual harassment or domestic violence. So, and it stems a lot from how they were socialized, what they witnessed growing up, what they experienced, whether they're from a broken family, quote unquote broken family, and it transcends into adulthood and how they in turn treat with their families. So it's good for us to have the conversation to ensure that people understand that this type of behavior is not acceptable. Maybe it is how you were raised, but there are better ways to resolve conflict than to resort to violence or harassment. And in terms of touching on the workplace for sexual harassment, it is good that we are now advancing legislation to mandate a written policy in the workplace to prevent this type of activity. And I hope the fact that we will now have a tribunal set up uniquely and specifically for treating with sexual harassment claims, we will see a significant reduction in the numbers in our country. And again, I'm an optimist. I genuinely believe we can have a total value shift, a change in our custom, and create the Jamaica we really want to see.
Delia, final words for you.
Well, I think you made a lot of wonderful final words, but really to just build on that, to say it's wonderful to have these fora. I think Jamaica has done a lot better in recent years on just speaking out, sharing so many talk shows and radio, again, social media, that's putting these things on the front burner. And that definitely has to be the start to let persons start shifting their views a little bit, or even if you disagree, to be open about speaking about these matters rather than being silent. And I also want to say that it's really important that we've had so many men on the panel today. I think I really want to commend them for coming, and for those who have thought it's important to include men in the conversation. Because I do believe that, unfortunately, the majority of the perpetrators of these types of violence are men, and I believe they have to be reached by men. So even though I'm a gender specialist and I lecture and, we try to do our best as women in these cases, I think we have to recognize that boys and men are reached by men. And it really, the onus will be on these men who are progressive, who understand the issues, to speak out so other men will actually listen or listen a little bit more than they would to some women sometimes. So just want to commend them and to ask that more men get involved in this thing. It's not a woman issue. We like to call it a woman issue. It's not a woman issue. It's a societal issue, and it's an issue that we all have to get involved in to rid it.
And as you said that, and I know I said it was a final point, Delia, but I wanted you to, from your gender specialist experience, just to touch real quick on some of the major impacts from a macro standpoint. So I'm sure there are economic impacts.
Oh yes, I mean, that's a whole other program. I think too, if our governments recognize how much money they spend on gender-based violence, there are lots of studies that have been done for the European Union, for the United States. It's billions of dollars. Lost work time, productivity, a hospital. You have to have whole arms of the police force for these types of cases. So it costs a lot of money for us to be maintaining gender-based violence, response to gender-based violence. So there's an economic cost, there's a psychological cost, there are physical costs, there are socialization costs. There's so many things that are being negatively affected. We'd be a much more productive society, much more equitable society, just happier, freer, better overall, if we could rid ourselves of it's not going to go away completely. Even you're an optimist, I'm a sort of pessimist, but even if it doesn't go completely, we have to stem the tide. And it's better for all of us if we stem the tide.
Yeah.
So we have to start to see it that way, that it's not just one sector. And we haven't even spoken about persons who live with disabilities, how they interact with the services. It's for everybody. Everybody has to be involved in this thing.
Yeah, Inspector Mitchell.
Right, I think they summed it up quite well. The constabulary force is here to serve, protect, and to reassure. And of course, as a force for good that we have been promoting for some time now, we are making steps, we are making strides to get things right, to get the right platforms together and the right avenues for people so that they can come to us freely, they can come to us and make a report and have the confidence to say that the constabulary force is really here to serve everyone. Everybody that comes through our doors should be able to come out feeling that they have been served properly. So we are making strides, we're doing our best to get on board with this, and we are here to serve and protect our people.
And I will say, as we close, that leadership is so important. We were talking earlier about the Chief Justice and how progressive he has been and how passionate he is about reforming the justice system. Your own police commissioner is also part of his brand. And it's very important. Yes, our legislators have passed this bill, but we really do need to own it. We need to ensure that we have the kind of inspirational leadership. Leadership for me is everything. You can have 10 laws all you want, but if you don't have the leadership behind it to say that yes, this is something we believe in, and we're going to put the resources behind it. I mean, we just talked about how important that is. Training is ongoing in the force, but to make sure that all of your people have the tools, they are aware and they feel empowered in order to act. Can I thank you so very much for joining us for this very important conversation. I'm also very excited about the people who are on Zoom, because they get an opportunity, those who are following us and who are with us for the conversation, to just fill out that survey and to indicate, whether they've been impacted by gender-based violence, and to have an opportunity to get one of those free spots. We are going to be giving minimum of 3 sessions to 25 people, thanks to the partnership and support of the U.S. Embassy in Kingston. So this really has been a great conversation. So very happy to have had Jamar Clark, Dr. Delia Bean, Sean J. Mitchell, and Jordan Bowden was here earlier. Special thanks once again to Bobby Adelson and the team at the U.S. Embassy in Kingston. Through their kind support, as I'd mentioned, we are going to be able to do something meaningful for those persons who have been impacted. Of course, confidentiality is everything, so just go ahead and click on that survey link and let us know if it's something that you will need or something that you're interested in getting, and we'll connect you with our counseling service provider. Let's keep this conversation going now. Follow us on social media. The handles are on your screen, and let your voice be heard at work, at school, and in your community. Sexual harassment and gender-based violence is definitely everybody's business. Join us again on November 25 when we turn the spotlight on intimate partner violence and the impact of the pandemic, what that has done to compound the problem. I'm Stacey Ann Smith. On behalf of our Stronger Together production team, walk good and stay safe.